Ben looked down at the fancy invitation that had come in the mail, feeling a mix of excitement and dread. It was for his high school reunion, a chance to reconnect, remember, and relive, or so the message said. But to Ben, the words seemed a bit too cheerful for what he expected to be a night full of awkward conversations and memories he had long tried to forget. Memories of his high school days came flooding back, particularly memories of his classmates who made sure he never forgot his place. Back then, Ben had been the quiet kid, the one who wore hand-me-down clothes and kept his head down, focused more on surviving each day than on making friends. The person who stood out the most in those memories was Derek, the golden boy of their school. Derek came from wealth, flaunted it proudly, and used it as a tool to look down on people like Ben. He'd mock Ben's clothes, his outdated backpack, and even the lunch he brought from home. Derek was popular, charming, and ruthless, the kind of person who ruled the school. For years, Ben had struggled under Derek's constant ridicule, feeling like he'd never be good enough. Now, more than a decade later, Ben had built a life of his own. He owned a successful tech company, a detail he rarely shared openly. He preferred to keep things low-key, allowing his success to speak for itself. But the thought of attending this reunion stirred something in him. He wondered if Derek was still the same arrogant bully, or if time had humbled him. For a moment, Ben considered tossing the invitation into the trash. But something held him back. Perhaps it was curiosity, or maybe a need to prove, if only to himself, that he had risen above the limitations they had once imposed on him. With a deep breath, he decided to go, hoping it might provide closure or, at the very least, some small satisfaction. That night, Ben found himself looking through his closet for something appropriate to wear. He didn't want to draw attention, but he also didn't want to appear as the same timid boy he once was. He settled on a modest, well-fitted suit. It was elegant yet understated, perfect for someone who had nothing to prove to anyone but himself. The next day, with a mix of nerves and excitement, he headed to the reunion. As Ben drove toward the hotel hosting the reunion, he felt a strange sensation in his chest, a blend of nostalgia and unease. The streets, the buildings, even the familiar trees that lined the sidewalk seemed to pull him back in time. It was almost as if he were a teenager again, heading to school and bracing himself for another day of enduring Derek's cruelty and the indifference of his classmates. He parked his car and stepped out, adjusting his tie and taking a moment to calm himself. He'd come a long way from the boy he used to be. He reminded himself that he was a successful CEO, someone with a life he was proud of. But the closer he got to the hotel entrance, the more he felt the shadows of his past creeping up on him. Inside, he could hear the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses, voices filled with excitement as old friends reunited. Ben took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and walked in, determined to hold his head high no matter who he encountered. Entering the event, Ben was immediately greeted by familiar faces, some of whom he hadn't seen since graduation. Many of his classmates greeted him warmly, their smiles genuine and welcoming. Some even seemed surprised to see him, as if they hadn't expected the quiet, shy boy from their past to show up at such an event. He caught up with a few old friends, exchanging stories about life, family, and work. It was comforting to see that some things hadn't changed, and the laughter they shared made him feel a bit more at ease. For a moment, he forgot about Derek, lost in the warmth of nostalgia and camaraderie. Yet, in the back of his mind, he knew it was only a matter of time before he crossed paths with his former tormentor. Sure enough, just as Ben began to feel at home among his old friends, he heard a familiar, arrogant voice from across the room. It was Derek, the same Derek who had once made his life miserable. He hadn't changed much, still tall, still wearing that cocky grin, still surrounded by people eager to impress him. Ben braced himself, knowing that this encounter was inevitable. Ben watched as Derek approached, flanked by a few old friends who seemed eager to keep his attention. Derek's eyes scanned the room, and when they landed on Ben, a smirk spread across his face. "Well, if it isn't Ben," Derek said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Didn't think you'd make it. Guess you finally scraped together enough to buy a decent suit, huh?" The comment stung, but Ben forced a calm smile, refusing to let Derek's words affect him. "It's been a while, Derek," he replied smoothly. "I thought it might be nice to catch up." He kept his tone light, even though he could feel the tension brewing. Derek's eyes narrowed slightly, as if disappointed that Ben hadn't taken the bait. "So, what have you been up to all these years?" Derek continued, still wearing that smug expression. "You work at a tech store or something?" The insult was obvious, but Ben simply shrugged, choosing to keep his response vague. "I'm in tech, yes," he replied, leaving Derek to assume whatever he wanted. As Derek's laughter echoed through the room, memories of high school humiliation surged in Ben's mind. He remembered the times Derek had mocked his clothes, his cheap backpack, even his mother's packed lunches. Derek had enjoyed making him feel small, a nobody who would never amount to anything. But tonight, Ben knew he was no longer that powerless kid. He forced himself to stay calm, though he could feel the hurt of those memories simmering beneath the surface. He thought about the sacrifices he'd made, the sleepless nights, the endless hours of hard work that had brought him to where he was today. The only person who truly knew his journey was himself. As Derek continued to laugh, oblivious to the man standing before him, Ben felt a surge of determination. He had endured years of ridicule, but tonight, he would finally put the past to rest. He didn't need to prove anything to Derek, but perhaps it was time to show him just who he had become. Turning away from Derek's ridicule, Ben moved toward a group of old friends who greeted him warmly. Some of them had been friendly in high school, though they hadn't stood up for him against Derek. Yet, their smiles were genuine, and their excitement to see him felt refreshing. They laughed together, shared stories, and reminisced about teachers and pranks from their school days. As they talked, one friend asked about Ben's career. Curious but respectful, she inquired about his work in tech. Ben explained it simply, avoiding any details about his position as CEO. He enjoyed their company, feeling a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. With each conversation, Ben's confidence grew. He realized that these friendships mattered far more than Derek's opinion ever would. For the first time, he felt grateful to be here, surrounded by people who saw him as a friend, not as someone to belittle. Eventually, Derek reappeared, clearly intrigued by the attention Ben was receiving. His curiosity masked a hint of jealousy, though he hid it behind his smug demeanor. "So, Ben," Derek said, joining the group, "what exactly is it you do in tech? Fix computers? Set up Wi-Fi networks?" The question was designed to embarrass him, but Ben met Derek's gaze with a calm expression. "Actually, I own a tech company," he replied evenly. The simplicity of his answer left Derek momentarily speechless, his smirk fading as he processed the words. For a moment, Derek seemed unsure of how to respond, but he quickly recovered, forcing a laugh. "A tech company, huh? Must be a small one." "I mean, anyone can start a business these days," he scoffed, though his tone held a trace of doubt. Ben said nothing, letting Derek's disbelief speak for itself. Word spread quickly among the group, and soon more people were aware of Ben's success. They looked at him with newfound respect, asking questions about his journey, curious to know how he had gone from the quiet kid they remembered to a successful entrepreneur. Ben shared parts of his story, but he kept it simple, focusing on the work and perseverance that had brought him here. As he spoke, he noticed Derek shifting uncomfortably, clearly unhappy with the attention Ben was receiving. Ben could sense Derek's discomfort growing with each word, and he felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that he no longer needed Derek's approval or anyone else's. For the first time, Ben felt truly free from the weight of his past. His success was his own, and he had earned every bit of it. Standing among his friends, sharing stories of resilience and growth, he realized that he had achieved something far greater than Derek could ever take from him. Ben's heart raced as he walked away from Derek, feeling a sense of triumph he hadn't expected. He thought back on how much he had struggled to get where he was now, how he had worked long hours, sacrificed sleep, and invested every ounce of energy into building his company. Every challenge, every sleepless night, every obstacle had shaped him into the man he was today. Standing there, among old friends who now looked at him with admiration, he realized he had done far more than prove Derek wrong. He had proven something to himself. As he spoke with his classmates, the conversations felt natural, genuine. They asked about his life, his achievements, but they also shared their own stories, their successes, their failures, their own struggles to make sense of life after high school. Ben felt a surprising kinship with them, realizing that everyone had faced challenges in their own way. In that moment, he felt truly understood. Derek, on the other hand, watched from afar, clearly uneasy with the shift in the room's energy. Ben could see him occasionally glancing over, his expression a mixture of curiosity and frustration. Ben didn't need Derek's validation anymore, but it was clear that Derek, perhaps for the first time, was unsure of himself. As the night went on, Ben found himself drifting between conversations, but his thoughts continued to return to the memories of his high school years. He remembered the relentless humiliation, the taunts, the feeling of inadequacy that had haunted him for so long. And yet, here he was, stronger, wiser, and with a clearer sense of who he was than ever before. Reflecting on the person he used to be, Ben felt a wave of compassion for his younger self. He realized now that every painful experience had been a stepping stone, guiding him toward a future he could have never envisioned. If not for those struggles, he might never have developed the grit and resilience that had fueled his success. In the midst of these thoughts, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. His success was not about proving anyone wrong, it was about becoming the person he was always meant to be. In that quiet moment of realization, he forgave not only Derek, but everyone who had ever doubted him, including himself. Later in the evening, as Ben was catching up with an old friend, he noticed Derek approaching once again. This time, Derek's demeanor was different. He no longer carried himself with the same arrogance. Instead, he looked uncomfortable, almost vulnerable. Ben could tell that Derek wanted to say something, but he didn't seem to know where to start. "Ben," Derek began, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "About earlier. I guess I went too far." He looked away, clearly struggling with his words. "I mean, it was all just joking, you know? We were just kids back then." Ben listened in silence, sensing Derek's discomfort. The apology felt incomplete, as though Derek wasn't sure if he truly meant it. But Ben saw something in Derek's eyes, a hint of regret, perhaps, or even shame. He realized that Derek's arrogance was, in part, a mask, hiding his own insecurities. Ben nodded slowly. "I get it, Derek," he replied calmly. "We've all grown up since then. I've moved past it." His tone was sincere, but he made no effort to comfort Derek. Ben didn't need Derek's remorse to heal. He had already found peace within himself. After Derek walked away, Ben rejoined his friends, feeling lighter than ever. He was surrounded by people who genuinely cared for him and who valued him for who he was. The weight of his past lifted, and he allowed himself to fully enjoy the night, free of old wounds. With each story they shared, each memory they laughed over, Ben felt a newfound appreciation for these friends who had quietly supported him, even if they hadn't always understood his struggles. One of his closest friends from high school, Sarah, pulled him aside. She had always been kind to him, even back then, but they had lost touch over the years. "I'm so glad you came tonight, Ben," she said, her eyes filled with warmth. "I always knew you'd do great things. It's inspiring to see how far you've come." Her words struck a chord deep within him, filling him with a sense of gratitude. He realized that despite the pain of his past, there had always been people who believed in him, who saw the potential in him even when he couldn't see it in himself. In that moment, he promised himself to stay connected with these friends who had been his silent supporters. As the evening began to wind down, Ben took a moment to step outside, breathing in the cool night air. He looked up at the stars, feeling an overwhelming sense of pride, not in his success, but in the journey that had brought him here. Every challenge he had faced, every moment of doubt, had led him to this point. He felt proud not because of what he had achieved, but because of who he had become. Ben thought about the people he had met along the way, the mentors and friends who had guided him, the family who had supported him, and even the strangers who had offered words of encouragement when he needed them most. Each of them had played a part in his journey, reminding him that success was never a solo endeavor. Standing there, under the vast sky, Ben felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond any measure of wealth or status. He knew now that his true success lay in his resilience, his kindness, and his willingness to rise above the bitterness of his past. And as he stood there, he felt ready to move forward, free from the shadows that had once held him back. Back inside, Ben noticed that Derek was sitting alone, looking uncharacteristically downcast. It was unusual to see him without his usual entourage of admirers, and Ben sensed that something was wrong. Though he had no obligation to comfort Derek, a part of him felt a pang of empathy. He approached, unsure of what he might say, but open to listening. Derek looked up as Ben approached, his face etched with exhaustion. "I don't expect you to understand, Ben," he said quietly, his voice stripped of arrogance. "But things haven't been as easy as I make them seem." He hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "All these years, I've felt like I had to prove something to everyone, to myself." For the first time, Ben saw Derek not as a bully, but as a person struggling with his own insecurities. It was a surprising revelation, and Ben felt a deep compassion for the man who had once tormented him. He realized that Derek's need for validation had likely fueled his cruelty, a sad attempt to cover his own fears and inadequacies. In that quiet moment, Ben and Derek shared a brief, unspoken understanding. Despite their vastly different paths, they were both human, both imperfect, and both searching for meaning in their lives. Ben offered Derek a simple nod, a gesture of acknowledgement that transcended their past animosity. It was a moment of silent forgiveness, one that didn't need words. Ben walked away from Derek with a newfound sense of peace. He knew now that his journey had been about much more than proving himself to anyone else. It had been about finding his own worth, his own sense of purpose, beyond the judgments and expectations of others. With each step, Ben felt lighter, freer, as though he had finally shed the last remnants of his old insecurities. He knew that the path he had chosen, though difficult, had been the right one. And he walked back into the reunion with a smile, ready to enjoy the rest of the night. The reunion continued, and Ben felt a warmth spreading through him as he reconnected with more old friends. They laughed, shared memories, and talked about the dreams they had once had as teenagers. Some had come true, others hadn't, but each person's story was unique, a tapestry of triumphs and challenges. Ben felt a newfound appreciation for these people, understanding that each of them had their own journey to take. One of his friends, Mark, turned to him and said, "Ben, I remember how you used to always work so hard, even back then. It's inspiring to see how far you've come." Ben smiled, feeling both humbled and grateful. He realized that these friendships, even if they had been distant for years, had a special place in his heart. He promised himself to stay in touch with them, to nurture these connections that had once been so meaningful. For the first time in a long time, Ben felt truly at home, surrounded by people who had been a part of his life, in big ways and small. As the night drew to a close, Ben felt a sense of closure he hadn't expected. The pain of his past, the hurt inflicted by Derek and others, had faded, replaced by a quiet confidence and peace. He had faced his past, embraced his journey, and found meaning in the challenges he had overcome. He was no longer the insecure boy from high school. He was a man who had forged his own path, driven by resilience and strength. Ben glanced around the room one last time, feeling a deep gratitude for this night, for the chance to reconnect and remember. He had come here seeking closure, and he had found it, not through revenge or validation, but through the realization that he had everything he needed within himself. With a final wave to his friends, Ben left the reunion, ready to embrace the future with an open heart and a clear mind. Driving home that night, Ben reflected on the road that lay ahead. He thought about the lessons he had learned, the people who had been there along the way, and the strength he had found within himself. He knew that life would continue to bring new challenges, new obstacles to overcome, but he felt ready to face them, grounded in his sense of purpose and self-worth. As he pulled into his driveway, he felt a surge of excitement for the future. He knew that his journey was far from over, and that each new day would bring opportunities to grow, to learn, and to continue becoming the person he was meant to be. The story continues, with Ben revisiting other chapters of his life with a newfound sense of gratitude and peace, embracing his journey as one of growth, resilience, and self-discovery. The morning after the reunion, Ben woke up feeling a sense of lightness he hadn't experienced in years. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the room. He lay there for a moment, letting the quiet calm wash over him, savoring the absence of the old tensions that had once plagued him. He had faced the people who symbolized his deepest insecurities, yet he had walked away stronger, more certain of himself than ever. As he made his way to the kitchen, he thought about how much he had allowed his past to weigh on him. It had lingered in the back of his mind like a shadow, even as he worked tirelessly to build his business, always pushing him to prove himself. But after last night, he felt something shift, as if he had finally let go of the weight he'd carried all these years. He realized that he didn't need to justify his success to anyone but himself. With a peaceful smile, he poured himself a cup of coffee and took a seat by the window, watching the world outside as it moved at its own steady pace. For the first time, he felt truly free from the judgments of his past, free from the need to prove anything to anyone, and free to just be himself. As Ben sipped his coffee, his phone buzzed on the table. It was Sarah, the friend he'd reconnected with at the reunion. Surprised but pleased, he answered the call, and her cheerful voice greeted him. "Good morning, Ben. I just wanted to say that it was so wonderful seeing you last night. You've come so far, and it's truly inspiring." Ben smiled, genuinely touched by her words. They talked about the reunion, the memories it had stirred, and the nostalgia that lingered. Sarah shared stories of her own journey since high school, the struggles, the small victories, the moments of doubt and resilience. They found common ground in their stories, both having faced their own forms of adversity to become the people they were today. As they spoke, Ben realized how much he had missed having friends who truly understood him. He promised Sarah that they would keep in touch, and she agreed enthusiastically, suggesting they meet for lunch sometime soon. Hanging up the phone, Ben felt a renewed sense of connection, not just with Sarah, but with the person he had become. Later that day, Ben decided to drop by his office, even though it was his day off. His team was surprised to see him, but they greeted him warmly, asking how the reunion had gone. Ben shared a few details, glossing over the uncomfortable moments and focusing on the positive. His team, who respected him deeply, listened with interest, genuinely happy for him. As Ben walked through the office, he took a moment to observe his team, the people who had become like family to him. They were all working hard, focused on their tasks, yet there was a lightness in the atmosphere, a sense of camaraderie and respect that Ben had worked hard to cultivate. He realized that he had created something meaningful, something far greater than himself. Ben's assistant approached, bringing him a report he had requested earlier in the week. As he glanced through it, he felt a surge of pride. This was the legacy he was building, a company based on integrity, respect, and resilience. The same qualities he had fought to embody in his own life were now woven into the fabric of his business, and he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. Just as Ben was preparing to leave the office, the receptionist informed him that he had a visitor. He was surprised to find Derek standing in the lobby, looking uncertain and out of place. Ben's initial instinct was to walk away, to keep Derek at arm's length, but something in Derek's expression stopped him. There was no trace of arrogance, only a quiet vulnerability that Ben hadn't seen before. "Ben, I just wanted to talk," Derek said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ben studied him for a moment, then nodded, gesturing for Derek to follow him to a private conference room. They sat down, and Derek took a deep breath, his eyes avoiding Ben's as he began to speak. "I know I wasn't kind to you back then," Derek admitted, his tone filled with regret. "I was insecure. I felt like I had to be better than everyone, and I took that out on you." He paused, glancing up at Ben with an expression of genuine remorse. "Seeing you last night, hearing about all you've accomplished, it made me realize just how wrong I was." Ben listened to Derek's confession, feeling a mix of emotions, anger, sympathy, and, surprisingly, compassion. He could see that Derek was struggling to come to terms with his past behavior, and while it didn't erase the hurt he had caused, it took courage to admit his mistakes. Ben felt a sense of clarity as he realized that he no longer harbored resentment toward Derek. "You know, Derek," Ben said softly, "I used to think that proving you wrong was all I wanted. But now, I understand that this journey was never about you. It was about finding my own worth, my own strength." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. "I forgive you, Derek. Not for your sake, but for mine. Carrying anger only holds me back, and I'm done with that." Derek looked down, visibly moved by Ben's words. For a moment, they sat in silence, a silence filled with understanding and release. They had both carried the weight of their past in different ways, and now, in this quiet moment, they were letting it go. After Derek left, Ben sat alone in the conference room, feeling a deep sense of closure. He had faced the person who had once symbolized his deepest insecurities, and he had walked away with his dignity intact. He felt lighter, as if a long-buried burden had finally been lifted from his shoulders. The forgiveness he had offered Derek wasn't just a gift to his former bully, it was a gift to himself. Ben realized that his success was defined not by the money he had earned or the title he held, but by the person he had become. In forgiving Derek, he had proven to himself that he was no longer bound by the pain of his past. He was free to move forward, unburdened and at peace. As he walked out of the conference room, he felt a newfound sense of purpose, a determination to continue building a life grounded in resilience, kindness, and humility. His journey was far from over, but he knew now that he had everything he needed to face whatever challenges lay ahead. That evening, Ben called his parents to share the news of his reunion experience. They were thrilled to hear about the success he had achieved, but even more so to hear about the closure he had found. His mother, who had always believed in him, expressed her pride, reminding him that his strength came from within and that he had always been destined for greatness. Ben's father, a quiet man who rarely showed emotion, told him how proud he was of the man Ben had become. For Ben, hearing those words from his father was a gift beyond measure. It was a moment of affirmation, a reminder that he had not only made himself proud but also the people who had supported him along the way. As he hung up the phone, Ben felt a renewed sense of gratitude for his family, for the support and love that had been a constant source of strength in his life. They had seen him through his darkest days, and he knew that he wouldn't be where he was without them. In the days that followed, Ben found himself reflecting on his journey with a sense of acceptance and peace. He no longer felt the need to prove himself, to fight against the ghosts of his past. Instead, he focused on the future, on the goals and dreams he had yet to pursue. With his company thriving and his relationships deepening, he felt ready to embrace whatever came next. He made a commitment to give back, to mentor young people who, like him, had faced adversity and needed someone to believe in them. He wanted to be the person he had once needed, a guide and a source of encouragement for others. It was a calling that filled him with purpose, a way to use his experiences to make a difference. Ben knew that his journey was far from over, but he was no longer afraid of what lay ahead. He had found his strength, his peace, and his purpose, and he was ready to continue moving forward with an open heart. Through his connections at work and his renewed friendships, Ben began to expand his social circle, meeting new people who shared his values and ambitions. He found himself surrounded by a network of friends who celebrated his successes, encouraged his growth, and supported him through every challenge. One evening, he attended a gathering organized by Sarah, where he met other professionals who had overcome their own hardships. Listening to their stories, Ben felt a profound sense of community, realizing that he was part of something bigger than himself, a world of people striving to make a positive impact. As he looked around the room, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for the connections he had built. He had found his place, surrounded by people who understood and respected him, not for his title or achievements, but for the person he was. One day, Ben met with a mentor he had long admired, a retired entrepreneur who had built a reputation for his integrity and compassion. Over coffee, the mentor shared stories of his own journey, filled with moments of triumph and failure, of lessons learned and wisdom gained. As they talked, Ben listened intently, absorbing each piece of advice, each insight. The mentor's words resonated deeply with him, reminding him of the importance of staying grounded, of remaining humble, and of never losing sight of one's values. Leaving the meeting, Ben felt inspired to continue growing, to keep learning, and to stay true to the principles that had guided him thus far. He knew that success was not a destination but a journey, one that required constant reflection and a commitment to growth. Ben began offering mentorship sessions at his company, sharing his story and the lessons he had learned with young employees who were just starting their careers. He encouraged them to embrace their struggles, to see failure as a stepping stone, and to believe in themselves even when others doubted them. The young employees looked up to him, inspired by his resilience and his willingness to be vulnerable. Ben found joy in guiding them, knowing that he was making a positive impact on their lives. In helping them, he felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond any financial success. Through mentorship, Ben had found a new purpose, a way to give back, to make a difference, and to ensure that his legacy was one of kindness, strength, and compassion. Years later, as Ben reflected on his life and the path he had traveled, he felt a deep sense of contentment. He had built a successful business, cultivated meaningful relationships, and created a legacy that would live on through the lives he had touched. His journey had been filled with challenges, but each one had shaped him, strengthened him, and brought him closer to the person he was meant to be. Standing by the window, watching the world outside, Ben smiled, knowing that his life had come full circle. He had faced his past, embraced his present, and found peace in his future. And as he looked out at the world, he felt a quiet joy, a gratitude for every moment, every lesson, and every person who had been a part of his journey. Ben's story was not one of revenge or validation, but of resilience, growth, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing who you are. His legacy would be a reminder to others that true success is found not in wealth or status, but in kindness, humility, and the courage to keep moving forward.